Looking forward to this talk for some time, as I have a great interest in the subject. Aaron, Diane, welcome.
Good evening, everybody. It's great to be here. I think this might be the liveliest, friendliest Civil War roundtable we've ever been at. Our table, at least, is pretty hilarious.
That's why we're sitting here.
Aaron's going to come up and talk about the military affairs in Missouri, but I'm going to talk about some of the political and social things, events that led up to this mess in Missouri. Anybody who's interested in history would be very interested in the Kansas-Missouri border region, and I think you'll, by the end of this evening, I hope you'll know why. There's a lot going on, and it's fascinating stories, multiple stories. We like this quotation from Sergeant Shriver, who says, "Just to travel is rather boring, but to travel with a purpose is both educational and exciting." We really hold to it, and that's why we wrote our book, The Big Divide. We identified some 7 what we call hinges of history that lead up to this period of the Civil War, and which are not only regionally important, but really affected the rest of the country as well. And the first one is Louisiana Purchase. In 1803, Jefferson and Napoleon Bonaparte had conversations that led to the purchase of the vast Louisiana Purchase that immediately doubled the size of the United States. And soon after that, Jefferson commissioned Meriwether Lewis and William Clark with the Corps of Discovery to explore this new territory. And that took them across the whole of Missouri and through part of Kansas. And both of these states in their entirety are part of are in the Louisiana Purchase. And that's about the last thing they have in common. So we've tried to prepare these hinges of history with some sites that we think you'd be interested in hearing about. And the site we chose for this, there are many sites that commemorate parts of Lewis and Clark's journey through Missouri. But the one we like a lot is Fort Osage in Sibley, Missouri. This is a reconstructed fort which was built originally under the direction of William Clark in 1808, and it stands on the same spot as the original fort. It's on a very high promontory of the Missouri River, really amazing views up and down the river. You can see exactly why it was chosen for a fort, and this is really a kid-friendly, great family place to visit. The next hinge of history is the Missouri Compromise. And that had big ramifications. Of course, this was the compromise that kept a sort of tenuous peace between the North and the South for about 30-some years. But it essentially brought Maine into the Union as a free state, Missouri into the Union as a slave state, and it had, as part of its provision, it said that there would be no slavery in the Louisiana Territory north of a line that ran through the southern border of Missouri, except for Missouri itself. And as you can see from this old map, that really sets up some real difficulties. It's pretty easy to see why this becomes troublesome in the years to come. The next, do we have a picture of that for anything? We're going to go right to 1830, 10 years later. President Jackson signs the Indian Removal Act, which brings some 20 sovereign Indian nations to live in the eastern part of Kansas. this is going to set up some real obvious difficulties when you open up Kansas territory, because there was really actually not a single acre of land in Kansas that was available for purchase when the territory opened up. But the Indian Removal Act also made it necessary to have overland trails. You couldn't just go across Kansas. There was a lot of forts that was drawn up across Kansas, and all of the forts that started out to different places began in western Missouri. First, you have the Santa Fe Trail, of course, in 1820 or 21, and that was an international trade route, of course, because it went to Santa Fe, Mexico. But later on, you have the trails going to California and Oregon, going across this whole big Kansas territory. You have the trail, the Mormon Trail, that goes to the Great Salt Lake, and for a very short time, but well remembered, is the Pony Express Trail that went from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California, just for about a year and a half in the early 1860s.
You want to talk about Shawnee Mission?
Yeah, I forgot about that. Shawnee Mission is a wonderful site. It's one of the oldest sites in Kansas, and it's on 10 acres of land in a suburb of Kansas City called Fairway, and it's been reinterpreted over the last decade to be really emphasizing the role of and the plight of the Indian children who went to the mission, instead of just a story of the missionaries triumph over the native population. So the sites that are connected with the overland trails, however, there are several. There's a National Frontier Trails Museum in Independence, Missouri. There is the Pony Express Museum, which is multi-sensory. You can feel and smell the trail. I don't know if you want to do that. And then, of course, there is the ironically named Liberty Jail, which was a place where the Mormon leaders were imprisoned while Missouri was trying to figure out how to kick them out of the state, which they did, of course. The next hinge of history is the KansasNebraska Act, passed in 1854, one of the most consequential pieces of legislation ever passed by the Congress. And this bill opened up Kansas territory to white settlement. It caused an absolute furor across the nation, at least across the northern part of the nation. The Southerners loved it, and so did the Missourians, who had been waiting, hoping, wanting to move themselves and their property across the border into Kansas territory. So they were delighted with this. There was also a provision in this Kansas-Nebraska bill that was really popularized by your own senator here, Stephen Douglas, who had popular sovereignty written into the Kansas-Nebraska bill, and that meant that the people who settled, the white male electorate that settled Kansas territory, would determine its fate, whether Kansas came into the Union as a free state or a slave state. Of course, it set up a tremendous amount of trouble in Kansas. The next one is John Brown, who is little known at the time when he comes to Kansas in 1855 to join his 5 sons who've already settled in Kansas. And John Brown is one determined man. He's failed at everything else he's done, but he comes to Kansas determined to keep slavery out by any means necessary, and he means that. So in the spring of 1856, there's a series of events. Senator Sumner is thrashed almost to death on the floor of the U.S. Senate. Makes our own political scene seem a little minor compared to that. And the next day, the town of Lawrence was raided and burned to the ground by border ruffians. And John Brown comes in the day after that happened in Kansas and goes home totally disgusted with the Free State cause and determined to do something about it. So he gathers his sons, and in the middle of the night, they go to 3 cabins on Pottawatomie Creek, haul out the 5 men, 2 of them just really boys, and kills them all in cold blood. This has a tremendous effect on the climate in Kansas, and it ushers in the period that we know of as Bleeding Kansas. It also really cements the abolitionists and makes them more determined than ever. They don't believe that John Brown is involved in this murder. I mean, they put that to the side, but the 2 sides really go through a great deal of strife after these events. And so the Bleeding Kansas era is, of course, one of the hinges of history and often thought of as contributing to the beginning of the Civil War. You can find John Brown sites in different places in Kansas. There's a John Brown Museum in Osawatomie, Kansas. There's a new state there's a state house in Kansas that has been redone at a cost of $300 million. And it has the famous John Stuart Curry paintings in its dome, and that's what you see on this slide.
Oh, and Blackjack Battlefield.
Oh yeah, and the Blackjack Battlefield. We must not forget that, because Kansans consider the Battle of Blackjack, which is really more of a skirmish. I think a couple people died, but it's really more of a skirmish. But it is the first time that Union and or pro South and pro Free State settlers have a pitched battle. And the interesting thing about this battle is that the U.S. forces the government forces were on the pro-slavery side. And John Brown led the Free Staters in this movement. And this is an emerging site in Kansas. The battlefield has been purchased and they have done some major work on it, but there's more to come. And then we come lastly to the Lecompton Swindle. How many of you have heard of the Lecompton Swindle? Probably a lot of people in this room.
Usually called the Lecompton Compromise.
Yeah. Well, this is a very interesting thing. Lecompton was the headquarters for the slave interest in Kansas. This was at a time when Kansas had 2 governments, one free state and one pro-slavery. And these were dueling governments, and the headquarters of the pro-slavery was Lecompton. And they got together to write a constitution that would bring Kansas into the Union as a slave state, even though at that point there really was a majority of Free Staters in Kansas. And they brought this to the U.S. Congress, and President Buchanan wanted to see it pass through. He was behind it all the way. But in comes the little giant, Stephen Douglas, and though he favors popular sovereignty, does not want to see it gotten illegally. And he knows this has been done illegally without without getting a majority of the Free State men even voting in this. And he helps to split the Democratic Party into northern and southern factions, thereby leading to a four-way race for president in 1860, and allowing Lincoln to win with a minority vote. And that's why Lecomptonites say Lecompton was responsible for Lincoln's election. It's a little town of 600 people today, but they are all about history, and they still have the Constitution Hall where the Lecompton Constitution was written, and they have lots of things going on, speakers and festivals and all sorts of activities. The town is very proud of its roots. And this is actually where we come into the picture. They have a group called the Lecompton Reenactors, and 12, 14 years ago, Aaron and I got involved with them. And they have kind of a town hall setting where everybody gets up and gives their spiel. Reenactments are not just for battlefields. So this is very much political. Everybody gets up and talks about their point of view. And Aaron and I represented an abolitionist woman. Aaron was a pro-slavery missionary. And right in this picture, he kind of looks like a Puritan, I think. We were, and we were, mind you, we were very new at this. So if you look at me, I'm really not very period perfect. The glasses have got to go, and that styrofoam cup has definitely got to go. So we started evolving. I started evolving, and by the time of Kansas Chautauqua, I've evolved into the woman whose biography I would end up writing, Clarissa Nichols. She was an abolitionist feminist who came determined to bring the women's rights to Kansas in the early 1850s, and I wrote her biography called Revolutionary Heart. Let's see, that's the last of it, right, Aaron? Okay, so now Aaron and I have spent a lot of time going through Kansas. I've become a part of the Kansas Humanities Council Speakers Bureau, and we've seen Missouri sites as well. And we realized that this is a story that has not been told. The story of this border region. Most people do a state-by-state kind of thing, but we realized you cannot tell the story of Missouri without telling the story of Kansas, and vice versa. We decided to organize the book. I think what's unique about our book is that we organized it chronologically instead of geographically. So it is organized into 9 different chapters, with each one of them prefaced by a substantial essay on what was happening at that time and how the sites are related to one another, so you kind of get a mini history of the region. But it starts with the land, goes to first people, goes to Trails West, Bleeding Kansas, 3 chapters on the Civil War, the post-Civil War era, and modern sites of liberty and justice. And now we're going to turn it over to Aaron.
One more word about the Big Divide. The reason we've been giving this talk for probably about a year now, and we pretty much always do a tag team, and we're trying out a new talk on you this year, because as we talked with people and up and down the Kansas-Missouri border region, we became increasingly aware that people had limited understanding of the significance of the entire border region. You can't go to other parts of the country and rifle through several hinges of history that shape not only the destiny of that area, but have national implications. The Missouri Compromise is, for 34 years, the way that North and South keep the peace. KansasNebraska is the thing that knocks the legs out from under that peace. Bleeding Kansas is a portent of what's about to come. And this is why we call it America's most consequential border. It's just a line in the dirt. If you come down there, the Missouri River divides Kansas and Missouri as far as Kansas City. For the next 150 miles down to Oklahoma and Arkansas state lines, there's nothing there. It's porous. It's permeable. It's just a line in the dirt. And so it's fascinating to us that people in Kansas, who are separated sometimes by mere miles, they can walk over to Missouri, will be completely unaware of things that have happened in Missouri's history during these momentous years, and vice versa. So what you're going to get here is mostly a review of the events that we came here to talk about tonight, Price's 1864 raid. But it's absolutely essential to know that these two have a long history, and it's a history that was never just about Kansas and Missouri. It was, in fact, a proxy fight for the North-South struggle, and would culminate in civil war. And so how appropriate it is that for at least that first year, one of the major battlegrounds in the Civil War is Missouri. In effect, Bleeding Kansas moves across the state line and becomes a struggle between pro-Union Missourians and pro-Southern Missourians. I said to people around the table, they're going to answer about 7 trivia questions from tonight's quiz in tonight's talk, I noticed. And one of them is about the special convention which was held to vote on secession. And it went 98-1 against secession. So Sterling Price was just voting with everybody else when he voted against secession. But of course, he knew that the allegedly Unionist new governor of Missouri, Claiborne Fox Jackson, was in fact trying to drag Missouri into the Confederacy and used Lincoln's call-up order of 75,000 to do it, following Fort Sumter. He didn't succeed, and so that set into motion a situation eerily similar to what had just happened in Kansas. Sterling Price and Claiborne Fox Jackson head south into the corner of Missouri and set up their own rump government. They're the ones who are claiming that the government in Jefferson City is the illegitimate one, and they've got the real one, and they set up their own legislature and pass laws, and the whole works. So it's just like Kansas all over again. The difference, of course, is that things are going to get much, much worse in Missouri than they ever were in Kansas, and of course much worse across the country. Rather than talk about these lead-up battles, we'll just let me tell you that each of these stands for an excellent battlefield site with great interpretation and visitor center, and well worth your visit. 2 of these, in fact, are among the best of the best. We call them our Big Divide top sites. Wilson's Creek, where you see, we're depicted here by the picture of Nathaniel Lyon getting shot off his horse. First Union general to die in the Civil War, 2 weeks after Bull Run. Pea Ridge, which was the question I got wrong. I answered Helena, Arkansas, was when Sterling Price got, so who knew? But it's where Sterling Price was the last general standing. Ben McCullough and his number 2 were both shot in the first day of battle at Pea Ridge. That is a fabulous park, by the way. Just pristine battlefield. It's what happens when you fight out in the country. And we'll come back to that in a moment. And then one that people often overlook, which is Lexington, Missouri. The Battle of the Hemp Bales. And I won't spoil the story for you, but it's a great story. And when all is said and done, and the rebels have been chased off the field at Pea Ridge, military control of the state of Missouri rests in the Union Army's hands, and they have it uncontested, essentially, until Price's raid 2.5 years later. But of course, something comes into the vacuum, doesn't it? And that's the guerrillas. The guerrilla warfare that breaks out along the Missouri-Kansas border, and now we know the preface to it. These are scores that are being settled, some of them dating back to the very first years of Bleeding Kansas. This guerrilla violence, historians agree, was the worst that happened not only in the Civil War, but anywhere on American soil at any time. This was treacherous stuff, and the reason why was because Missouri was a house divided. Yes, the official line was against secession, but especially in the southern part of the state, a lot of families sent boys off to fight in the CSA, or in Sterling Price's state guard that he set up under now former Governor Jackson. The guerrilla fighting is not usually considered an integral part of the war narrative. I think people, when they think about guerrillas out east in the Eastern Theater, they are the kind that harass the generals, and so you have to send Phil Sheridan or Nathan Bedford Forrest in, or sometimes those guys get confused with guerrillas. But out here in Missouri, it becomes the dominant narrative, because you literally have pro-Southern farms next to pro-Union farms, and they start burning down each other's farms. They begin killing each other. There's a lot of loyalty oaths and midnight challenges, and it's just a bad scene. Kind of, and underscored by the fact that the Trans-Mississippi is this fairly sparsely populated region. So for some reason, I guess that makes the violence worse. There are 3 reasons, though, that the guerrilla troubles along the border deserve our attention, because these are matters of national importance and significance. The first is probably the newest one. Historians have known about what happened out in Island Mound for decades, but we just noticed it's starting to creep into mainstream Civil War narratives. While the Union Army out in Washington is trying to decide what to do with all the contraband, and Frederick Douglass, of course, is urging them to put a gun in their hands and a U.S. badge on around their pants and send them off to shoot rebels. They haven't quite they haven't quite summoned up the backbone to actually arm and send out the black soldiers to fight for the Union Army. So Jim Lane, the incorrigible general and senator, sitting senator from Kansas, who in many ways represents the Kansas guerrilla threat, because the Jayhawkers and the Redlegs were in fact also participating in guerrilla activity. He's trying to push back against bushwhackers which are threatening Kansas farms along the state line. And he'll take whatever warm bodies he can find. Because again, Kansas has sent more men off to the Civil War percentage-wise than any other state in the Union. And there's just not a lot of men back home. So he organizes Indian Home Guards, and he organizes the first all-black militia. This is the Kansas Colored First Militia, and sends him across into Bates County, Missouri, to chase off some bushwhackers who have taken over a homestead there. The place is known as Island Mound, and the state of Missouri, on the occasion of the 150th, dedicated a new state park just to the memory of Island Mound, a great site. Incident number 2, I think you're all very well aware of, and that is Quantrill's raid on Lawrence. It is the worst act of domestic terrorism before 9/11, and that includes Oklahoma City. 200 unarmed men and boys killed, mostly in their pajamas. Some were burned alive in their homes. This was a savage act of retaliation, and we can talk about it in the Q&A. But it really, that is a real event out here. It's probably the signal event of 1863, because it leads to this. A few days later, General Ewing, who's taken over command of the Union Army of the Border, says, "I've had it with these Missouri bushwhackers and all of their women and their silent compatriots who provide them with intelligence and shelter. Everybody's got to go." And he issues General Order Number 11, the greatest punitive domestic act prior to the Japanese internment camps in the United States. 20,000 Missourians, doesn't matter what their loyalty was. If they took a loyalty oath, they could move to the garrison, but they had to get off their farms, they had to get off their land, they had to leave their villages behind. In Jackson, Cass, Bates, and part of Vernon counties, right along the border where Ewing was experiencing the worst of the guerrilla incursions into Kansas. And that, of course, inspires this great painting from Missouri's greatest 19th century painter, George Caleb Bingham, which he called martial law, but everybody else calls Order Number 11. And so these are significant moments in the lead up to Price's raid. So here's Joe Shelby, and he's my favorite. He's probably my favorite Confederate warrior, and certainly the best character in the Trans-Mississippi region, which, as was suggested by the trivia quiz, did tend to become a graveyard of generals who had fallen out of favor with Washington and Richmond. Joe Shelby wasn't like that at all. He was a young pup when he first got involved in these border activities. He did, in fact, lead bushwhacking raids. He may or may not have voted illegally in the 1855 elections in Kansas. And he is a very successful hemp farmer and probably one of the largest slave owners in central Missouri in the 1850s. Come wartime, he immediately funds with his own money a cavalry troop, brings his company of men down to Sterling Price in southwest Missouri and begins his ascent. He very quickly establishes himself as a master cavalryman, and his signature achievement, led with his Iron Brigade, as they're known, is a raid that he thought of and talked the then Missouri governor in exile, Thomas Reynolds, who was in Marshall, Texas at that time, into allowing him to take 800 men on a raid up into Missouri. They have a threefold goal. One is to get some more recruits. Another is to inflict a lot of damage on the Union. And the third is to just generally raise spirits in Missouri, which has, after all, been under Union occupation now for the better part of 2 years. He starts in near Texarkana and makes his way up to central Missouri near his home in Waverly, all the way back, 1,400 miles. He comes back with more men, more provisions, and more ammo than he started. Shelby's raid is one of the great romps of the Civil War. Probably not as well known as some of the raids out east, but you talk to anybody who's a buff of the Trans-Mississippi West, and Joe Shelby is always near the top of the list. Shelby has, it's worth noting, a different relationship with the guerrillas than a lot of the Confederate brass do. The role of the guerrillas is always very controversial. Now, of course, the Confederate Army, in one sense, can't do without them, because particularly in Missouri in 1862 and 3, when Jefferson Davis has called almost every company out to the Mississippi River to help fight off General Grant. During that time, the guerrillas are really the only ones who are harassing the Union Army, and they're doing a mighty good job of it. The estimates range from 20, 30, 40,000 Union troops that are basically parked in Missouri doing very little other than chasing after bushwhackers. So they're very effective, and Shelby recognizes this. This is a tintype I found just this week. I've never seen this before. The person on the right is young, probably Colonel J.O. Shelby. And the person on the left is Bloody Bill Anderson. During Shelby's raid, there was a lot of intelligence shared with the rebel forces that came from these irregulars, as they were known. The Confederate Army had tried deputizing these guys, calling them partisan rangers. This was an idea that already by the late 1863 was falling out of favor, particularly with the Eastern generals. Robert E. Lee recommended that they end it because he says they're just bad advertising. Today we would say that they were damaging the CSA brand by raiding civilians regardless of their loyalty, by killing civilians, not just concentrating on, and yeah, running around with scalps. Bloody Bill loved his scalps. But Shelby saw that they were useful, that they kind of were a supplement to what they were doing. 800 men is nothing. So it was helpful to have these guys who knew the land, knew their way around, and could and you didn't need to deputize them. Almost everybody above Joe Shelby felt differently, and that will play itself out in the raid that is named after this man. So you saw the quote, you saw the trivia question about Edmund Kirby Smith, who's the commander of forces in the Trans-Mississippi. The idea of doing another raid into Missouri begins to percolate in early July of 1864. It's pretty dire times for the South at this point. And Price volunteers to lead an expedition that has essentially the same goals as Shelby set when he went on his raid. Come back with provisions. The South is desperately short on just about anything. And cheer up the people there. And then, because he used to be the governor of Missouri, and because he was involved in the partisan squabble right at the beginning of the war, his third objective is to bring Governor in exile Reynolds with him, invade Jefferson City, and install him. And that would tip the balance politically in the state of Missouri, which, after all, did get voted a star right there on the Confederate flag. It's still there today. The problem is that Sterling Price is not the general to do this. And there's the quote from Edmund Kirby Smith up there. Feels that he's not equal to the command. Part of the reason is that over the course of 3 years, Sterling Price has gotten fat. This is a statue back in his hometown in Kaysville, Missouri, and it's supposedly from about the same time as that portrait. But the portrait looks so flattering compared to this thing, you know. Looks like, you know, just a big tub of butter on two skinny legs. He did not ride on his horse because he weighed at that point about 300 pounds, and instead he would be pulled around in a buggy. That was how old Pap got around toward the end of the war. He had a string of very mediocre performances in the Mississippi theater. It's one of the reasons he's back in the West. But he is given permission to launch this raid because the hope is that, of course, that if he accomplishes any of his goals, it will be a success. The problem is he pitches this in the middle of July and doesn't get out of Arkansas on his way to Missouri with his 10,000 men and all his cavalry until September the 6th. Atlanta has fallen. So right there is part of the political objective, which is to flip public sentiment enough to endanger the re-election of Abraham Lincoln, which was not looking that good just 1 month earlier. And at the time he pitches the raid in July, Abraham Lincoln's re-election is looking very dire indeed. So that's part of the problem. The other problem is he launches his raid with way too few men. So whether it was Sterling Price or Governor Reynolds or even Joe Shelby, all of these Missouri Confederates operated under a shared set of delusions. And this really is, you know, what Robert E. Lee, what Jefferson Davis once said, died of a theory. So these are the theories that killed Price's raid. The first was the feeling that Missouri was rife with pro-Southern sentiments and that there would be mass enlistments as soon as they entered the state of Missouri. And men would just throw themselves at Sterling Price. That actually was true for a little bit at the beginning of the raid, but mostly by 1864, there's a reason there was a draft going on. No one was rushing to enlist for either the North or South at that time. The arrival of the Confederate Army would flip the state politically. As we will see, that didn't even happen. And while it is said that Price's raid did forestall the shipment of several thousand troops out east to aid General Sherman in his march to the sea, that's not what turned the election for. Remember, Sherman waits until after the election to do the march from the sea. He's already won the hearts and minds of the North by taking Atlanta. And so, but the primary delusion is this idea that you ride into Missouri and you will be, what was the phrase? Greeted as liberators? that was the major Confederate delusion. But of course, Price's raid rises and falls based on its commander, and it gets off to a very bad start. He enters southeastern Missouri and is making his way, as said in the quiz, to St. Louis, which is a surprisingly lightly guarded town for being such a Union stronghold. So he's on his way there, but he gets distracted by this small fort near a town called Pilot Knob in southeastern Missouri. He learns that Thomas Ewing, yes, the guy on the horse in the George Caleb Bingham painting, the man who orders order number 11, he's in there right now in command of about 200 bluecoats. And so decides, let's lay siege, let's take this, this is a prize for us. Joe Shelby is the only general who states his opinion that that is not a good use of all of this manpower, and he is proven correct. Price orders his divisions broken up among 3 commanders, and they attack different sides of Fort Davison. The problem is they don't attack them in any kind of a coordinated manner, and so despite the limited amount of artillery that they got inside that little thing, they're actually able to, it's like a level 1 of a video game, you know, you're actually able to boom, 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 and then push the things over there and boom, 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 and they inflict 10 times more casualties than they take on. And it just absolutely stops the momentum of Price's army. And now, of course, the cat is out of the bag. There are 10,000 Confederates in Missouri, and so reinforcements come into St. Louis, and so that's off of Price's to-do list, is invading St. Louis. But probably the most humiliating aspect of the Battle of Pilot Knob is, as you can see here, this illustration shows a sort of a side view of the fort, and that the fact that they have a dry moat and there's a single drawbridge out of the fort. Well, the Confederates have taken a beating. They retreat, and the plan is they're going to build themselves some ladders and climb into Fort Davidson the next day and finally end this nonsense, right? But while they're sleeping, the drawbridge is slowly, quietly lowered, and a roll of burlap is put on the drawbridge so nobody can hear it while the entire fort is emptied of men and munitions. There is a powder magazine in the middle of the fort. They set a long fuse to that, and at 6 in the morning, with everybody long gone, the whole thing goes bang! And a mile away, people say, what the hell was that? But they still don't go to check for 2 more hours. And by that time, you know, the Ewing's down the road. He's a much more reinforced center. It's just a humiliating setback and a bad omen for what's to come. General Price welcomed Bloody Bill and his friends at a reception in central Missouri during the raid. They brought him scalps. He demurred. He gave them ribbons or medals or something, said nice things about them, and then told them to go off to north central Missouri and take out some of the railroad lines. Now, they were happy to do this because it was essentially a sanctioned slaughter of anybody who happened to be on the railroads at that time. And the Centralia Massacre is probably the one that we know the best. This is where more than 100 Union officers, many of which were not armed, they were off duty, they were riding home on furlough, were pulled off trains and massacred by the Bloody Bill's men. And Bloody Bill Anderson and George Todd have essentially taken over the raiders from Quantrill in a power struggle. So that's grisly, but it's also playing right into the Union Army, which has been chasing these guys up and down the border, and they've been unable to find them. But now with Price sort of keeping them at arm's length, not too close to him, where they could actually team up like Shelby and the Guerrillas did, but sort of keeping them at arm's length, they're always within sight. And over the course of Price's raid, almost all the major ringleaders and many of their lieutenants in these guerrilla gangs are taken out by the Union Army. And that leads us to really the biggest strategic blunder of this, and that was Sterling Price's obsession with bringing goods back to the South. The wagon train starts at about 300. By the time he gets to Westport, there's 500 wagons, and they're loaded with stuff. His men take them from all kinds of sources. Doesn't really matter, again, what their loyalties are. And so, again, this hearts and minds thing, they're just not into that. They're really just into loading up the wagons and taking them to the South. These people got stuff our guys back in Arkansas don't. And so the locals are upset. And as the campaign proceeds, this 500 wagon supply train becomes an oppressive burden, as Howard Monette, probably the best historian of the Battle of Westport, puts it, on the Confederate Army. It limits their movement. They can go 20, 25, 30 miles a day in a wagon train. They can go almost double that. At least their cavalry can, if they are unencumbered by this. And this proves that this will ultimately catch up to them. Well, things aren't entirely rosy over on the Union side as well. As I say, this is kind of a place not only where some generals who fell out of favor with Washington wind up, like Rosecrans and Pleasanton. It's where the old sectional battle between Kansas and Missouri plays out anew. And I'll show the person who suffers from it, and he looks like he's suffering here, is General Sam Curtis. Now, Sam Curtis at this is the commander at of the Union forces at Pea Ridge. He's had a pretty distinguished record, but he's mostly been out west. He loses his son to a Quantrill raid in Baxter Springs. His son's assassin will be taken out in short order during the Battle of Westport. But what his intelligence comes back with is not only that Sterling Price has got this enormous force of 10,000 or more rebels coming up from Arkansas, but that they're heading due west for Kansas. Turns out Price thinks that there's quite a lot to be had in Fort Leavenworth, and he's headed there. The first thing Curtis does is call up the governor of Kansas, and Kearney, and say, Governor Kearney, we need as many men as you can spare. Doesn't matter if they haven't held a rifle. We'll drill them, and we just need men to stay off this existential threat to western Missouri. And the governor says, I'm sorry, I have an election coming up in 3 weeks, and I need those guys to vote for me. At that very moment, Governor Kearney and Jim Lane are fighting for the soul of Republican Kansas. This isn't just a 21st century storyline. Republicans in Kansas have been fighting each other ever since the beginning. And Kearney wants assurances that this threat is real. He actually called Rosecrans in St. Louis and he says, yes, it's a real threat. And so then he musters his men into action. Curtis sends his most trusted general, James Blunt, who has already won in Indian country, is a close ally with Jim Lane, and has 2,000 men at his disposal to go out as far east as he can, around Lexington, and intercept Price, and with the idea that he will bring reinforcements from Kansas. But Governor Kearney says, no, we'll defend Kansas. We're not going to defend Missouri. You're on your own with Missouri. As a compromise, they wind up settling in just east of the Kansas state line, and that's why we have the Battle of Westport, not the Battle of Lexington, Second Battle of Lexington, or the Battle of Independence today. And that actually turns out to be kind of a big deal, as we'll explain in a moment. So Blunt winds up fighting basically a stalling action with his 2,000 men. He meets Shelby at Lexington, and then he falls back to the Little Blue River just east of Independence, and they clash there, and then he falls back and is met in Westport. This is probably the best map for me to use, because I don't do well with a lot of red and blue flags lined up. I'm spatially challenged that way. This tells the story very, very simply of what happens when the band finally pulls into Kansas City on October 23rd, 1864. In a nutshell, Blunt and Curtis are able to align their forces around the Country Club Plaza, today's Country Club Plaza, Brush Creek, which is the big shopping district in Kansas City, and faces a huge hill that pushes up toward Jacob Luce Park south of the plaza. On the other side of Luce Park, Shelby and Fagan have the rebel forces lined up, and then Marmaduke is guarding the flank here along the Big Blue River. What Pleasanton is able to eventually do is break through ford the Big Blue, get in Marmaduke's rear and his right flank, and push him back. And so now Shelby is caught in that same pincer with Blunt coming down here, Pleasanton coming down here, and for good measure, I forget if it's Moonlight or somebody actually gets in the back of Price's wagon train, which is trying to scurry around all of this way south of Kansas City down by Harrisonville. This is the first but not last time that Joe Shelby covers Sterling Price's rear in more ways than one. Because with his wagon train under imminent attack, Shelby and his Iron Brigade dismount and heroically defend the rear of the Confederate line and allow them to escape, which, coupled with some communication problems with the Union leadership, allows them to get out. And so the Battle of Westport, very savage fighting, thousands of casualties to be sure. We'll never have an exact number of it because it was a running battle, and they basically, as Monette said, left the civilians to count and bury the dead. That was what happened with Westport. It is rated a Class A battlefield in the National Park Survey. As you can see, it's really one of only 3 major battles on this map. I've added a 4th one because it's in our book, and because you should know that Ed Bars has been a big advocate for the battlefields at Newtonian, Missouri, which, along with Wilson's Creek and Pea Ridge and Carthage, is well worth your visiting. It's just maintained by a small group right now, but it is an emerging site. This is why it matters that they didn't fight out in the country, and they fought in Kansas City. This Class A battlefield is almost completely paved over by the streets and sidewalks of Midtown Kansas City. The sons and daughters of Kansas City, in concert with the Monette Fund, have put together a 24-stop auto tour, which is, and if that sounds kind of mind-boggling, it is, particularly when you're driving, in the middle of a major urban area, trying to spot signs at 35 miles an hour. They're not well marked. You don't really get, take a look. Would you get a sense of, it does require some imagination. Particularly when you look at Hinkle's Grove, and they say that this was a secret way that the rebels were able to cut through Blunt's line. There's nothing secret about a controlled intersection. So this is a real problem, and I will say that the Monette Fund and the Westport Historical Society and other friends of the Battle of Westport are doing their darndest They've acquired a slice of land in an old industrial park. They're in the process of removing all the buildings on there and creating a space at a part of the Big Blue River called Byram's Ford that will give you a sense of one of the major turning points on the Battle of Westport. And the reason why I say you should keep your eye on this is because there was no Battle of Island Mound site even 5 years ago. And 40 years ago, Wilson's Creek, it was just a patch of grass that people were starting to interpret and develop and survey and all that stuff. But there's nothing inevitable about the preservation of important Civil War battlefields. Westport is a sad reminder of that. But as we've seen elsewhere, particularly in the Trans-Mississippi region, it's also encouraging that you can actually see people working toward that goal. And finally, before I hand it back for just a quick sign-off by Diane, a little postscript, post-mortem as it will, for Joe Shelby. He comes back, he does go off to Mexico, doesn't surrender, and so he comes back as the undefeated general of the Confederate Army. And then something really interesting happens. He becomes a committed Unionist, a U.S. Marshal in Kansas City. He's friends with the James brothers, so he's not, he didn't exactly get religion. But over the course of 30 years, he really does a lot of reconsidering, and he basically distances himself from the whole lost cause school. And in the last year of his life, he gives an interview to the historian William Connolly in which he says, "John Brown was right, I was wrong, and if we had ever met out in Kansas during the Bleeding Kansas era, he would have had every right to kill me." Joe Shelby is really a stand-up guy. He's made in America, self-taught horseman, military success story, probably the greatest warrior that came out of the Trans-Mississippi West, certainly one of the great Confederate soldiers. He's now buried at that, pretty much on a line of where he made his last stand as he was saving his army from what would eventually be, they would eventually catch up to the wagon train down in Kansas, and Price would have to burn a lot of his train just to get out. But he's now buried in Forest Hill Cemetery, roughly on the line with where he made his last stand. And he's buried about, I would say, 50 feet away from the greatest Negro Leagues pitcher in history, Leroy Satchel Paige. And some admirers, that wasn't the tombstone that Satchel paid for, but some admirers, some baseball fans, pulled together and built actually two tombstones. One has all of his great sayings on it, like "Don't look back, somebody might be gaining on you." And we put this in our book because we wanted you. We like the fact, and I think Joe Shelby would like the fact that he now lives that one of Missouri's greatest slave owners now lives in an integrated neighborhood.
So that's about it. We have, I think you're going to roll this for some more, just so you can get an idea of some of the really other outstanding sites that you could visit in the Kansas-Missouri border region. There's the Arabia Steamboat Museum, whom you've probably all heard of already, and what else? Jesse James's farm, which avoids all the kind of crazy stuff that's said about Jesse and really tries to get at the truth of this man. Then we've got George Washington Carver, ex-slave, who had to leave Missouri in order to become a man and a great man. This is a fantastic site. Not just it's said that is a monument, but it's much more than that. It's a full visitor center and trails and so forth. The National World War I Museum is in Kansas City itself, and of course all of the Truman sites, the Truman Library. I especially love the house that he and Bess lived in. It's really sweet and humble and very telling. And what's the last one there? Brown v. Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. A wonderful museum commemorating that historic civil rights case. And so we want to leave you just with an invitation to come on down. We're only 500 miles from Chicago. You can get there by car, or you can fly in, or you can do it as Aaron and I like to do, is just take the train, which is what we're going back on tomorrow. We'll leave at 3 in the afternoon, get back to Kansas City at 10 tomorrow night. So it's not that far away, and it's really a very, very rich place to visit. We hope you all come. Thank you. Oh, yeah, one more thing. We also do have some copies of our book, The Big Divide, a guide to historic and Civil War sites in the Missouri-Kansas border region. So we'd be happy to sign those for any of you interested. Thanks.
Questions?
Yes. Yes, you, sir.
Okay.
Yeah.
Two things. First of all, May will mark the 60th anniversary of the Brown decision. And two, those cinema fans who have seen the movie True Grit, General Sterling Price was the name of John Wayne's cat in the movie.
Sure.
Yeah, you see those old Confederates pop up all the time. In the darndest places. That darn cat. The Outlaw Josie Wales is our favorite kind of cheesy movie from that time. 60th anniversary of the Brown v. Board decision, which in my mind launches the modern civil rights movement, is coming up. That site is the old Monroe Elementary School, which was the segregated elementary school. Topeka had desegregated its high schools and middle schools, but for some reason not its elementary schools. And so it was that school that was combined with others mostly from the South in the Brown versus Board packet. Emma.
Just a logistical sort of thing. That raid, how long did it last? I mean, you say September 6th is when they kicked it off.
That raid.
Westport was what?
So the raid begins September 6th. They arrive and they hit Pilot Knob about 2 weeks later, and don't make it to Westport they don't make it to the outskirts of Jackson County till the 19th of October, and then it's just non-stop running action for the next week until they're finally basically blown apart at Mine Creek, which is just across the state line in Kansas. It's the only Civil War site in Kansas. Another very nice site because it happened out in the country. The wagon train got bogged down in the water. It's basically what happened. Yes?
If his original intent was to go to Jefferson City or even St. Louis, if he had done that, what do you think the implications were?
Well, I think if he had made it to St. Louis, it would have been a terrifying thing. I think that
Could he have held it?
it was a poorly defended. Well, see, now this is always the problem with Confederate actions north of the Missouri Compromise line, is that they could never hold anything. And so, like all those successes from 1861, Wilson's Creek and Lexington and Carthage, for that matter, they couldn't hold them. They couldn't even hold Southwest Missouri, which is where, if you're going to have a Confederate fiefdom, that's where you're going to have it. Maybe along the Missouri River, but for various reasons, there was never that strong a feeling as there was, and still is, by the way, for the South in Southwest Missouri. So would he have held it? It's not clear that he would have been able to hold it because the Union controlled the Mississippi River, including all the way up to Helena, Arkansas, as we know. But would that have been necessary? Just making it that far into a northern town, and let's say he had made it there in the middle of August, and there's no word coming out of Atlanta. So, and the convention, well, the Democrat convention is going on, or about to happen. As I say, I'm not into, what do they call that, contrafactual history. I'm not into the what ifs so much, but if the strategy was to work at all, they had to execute on St. Louis, Jeff City. Again, Governor Reynolds is there. Install me. They go right past Jeff City. It's clear that it was disorganized. That a lot of the guys who were jumping on were just good time Charlies. There was a lot of plundering,
A lot of desertions.
a lot of desertions, and on the way back from Mine Creek, they got hit by smallpox. Lost hundreds of men. I mean, they didn't stagger back into Pocahontas, Arkansas until until southwestern Arkansas until December, and they were one miserable lot.
You mentioned something about the Battle of Newtonia. I'm not aware of anything like that. When did that take place?
You want to talk about Newtonia? Well, we have two of them.
62, there are two battles at Newtonia, and it has the distinction of being the one of the few places where Native Americans fought on both sides of the battle. That's the first battle, and I think were they interested in the lead mines there, Aaron? Something like that.
It was an anti-guerrilla action.
Yeah, and the second battle of Newtonia is when Shelby's again does a rearguard action, and Price's army is trying to escape, and they're a little slow, and so he very bravely marches out into the middle of the field. And they all get off their horses and fight, and so. Yeah, very effectively. So it's a site. They've got a lot of land now. I don't know how many acres, but they do have enough to make a go of it. But it's an evolving site.
You didn't bring up anything about the effects of the German immigrant population in Missouri, keeping Missouri in the Union.
Okay, you're more German than I am, so you answer this.
Yeah, the German population was in our part of the state, in western Missouri, had a very hard time of it. They were often searched and hunted down just because of their names, if that's what you're talking about. But they were almost uniformly Union men and Union families, and were some of the ones that got a really hard deal of it as the war went on.
Yeah, Franz Siegel's.
In fact, they were driven. I think they were driven en masse out of some places, like Lexington,
Yes,
for one
right.
place.
That's right.
They were all told, "Get out of here."
Franz Siegel's undistinguished military career can be completely explained by the fact that he spoke German and went back to the 48 revolutions in Europe, and so he was a guy who could get a lot of Germans to enlist in. And the Battle of Carthage is an interesting battle because it's one of the very few majority German language speaking regiments in.
Right.
In fact, maybe the only one in the Civil War.
It was a majority minority.
Yeah. Yeah, Bruce.
Saw the movie Ride with the Devil. What event is still there in Lawrence, Kansas about the Quantrill Reenactments?
Great question.
Well, for the
Quantrill's raid.
for the first time, oddly enough, Lawrence has never made a lot of its of Quantrill's raid. I mean, they have a festival or a fair at the end of August, Civil War commemoration, and people do academic talks on it and so forth, but they never really had any public space devoted to talking about this Quantrill's raid until recently, just opened this last August, so that the Watkins Community Museum has an excellent permanent exhibit on Quantrill's raid. Now I've forgotten your question. What was that?
That kind of
I
was
think
it.
you got the answer.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Cody, a minute by minute how it went down. Very, very well done.
Order number 11 depopulates literally a couple of counties. How long did it stay in effect? Was it the rest of the war, or were they able to sneak back
How long
in?
was order number 11?
I'm not entirely sure of that. I know some people started drifting back, but mostly, I think a great many people, up to 50 and 60% in some areas, never returned. That's probably more the point. Not only were the homes burned, the fields were all burned. There is belatedly now a statue or a commemoration of Order Number 11, Harrisonville, Missouri, and it is fittingly a chimney, because what was left standing after Order Number 11 was carried out were just these chimneys, and so they called them somebody's Jennison's tombstones. And so there's a good commemoration of that now, and a lot more being written about that, which is about time.
Yeah, and that's some of the, and that explains some of the bad blood between Kansans and Missourians, is the fact that people always talk about Quantrill, but nobody ever talks about the Redlegs and people like Jennison, who actually had was an officer in the 7th Kansas Cavalry who really instigated the most punitive actions, which was the burning of the homes and the pillaging of the fields following Order Number 11.
Yeah, I think Ride with the Devil does a good job with telling what happened along the border. I had to see it 3 times, and I know a little bit about this history before I kind of got what was going on. But because it's a complicated story, and that's probably why that movie never got to be a big hit with a lot of people. But I think it's very good portrayal.
Yeah, it wears well. Yes.
I was going to say, one of the sites in that area you can add to your list of significance is the beautiful monument to the Buffalo Soldiers at Fort Leavenworth, which is right up from Kansas City, which started a year after the Civil War.
It's in there, as is a wonderful site. We didn't talk really much about after the war, but we have a whole chapter of sites dedicated to kind of this release of pent-up energy. Some of it caused by the fact that there was a war going on, some of it caused by the fact that the obstructionist Southern Bloc in Congress held up the Homestead Act, the Railroad Act, the Morrill Act for land grant colleges. All of that begins finally getting through Congress during the war, and then after the war you see a lot of this happening. And then, of course, that includes enlisting of Union veterans and other black soldiers, the Buffalo Soldiers. It took a deputy commander at Fort Leavenworth named Colin Powell to drive down the main drag at Fort Leavenworth and say, why is there no tribute to these men who trained here? And in fact, there's now a whole African American military driving tour throughout Fort Leavenworth. It takes you to Fort Sully, where it was thought that would be where because they knew that Price was coming to Fort Leavenworth, and so they put up a picket of all black soldiers. That's commemorated. And there's some other things there. The Frontier Army Museum is a wonderful museum at Fort Leavenworth. Kind of an old school museum, Love kind of older in the tooth exhibits, too many words, that kind of thing. But it really, you just come away saying, I had no idea that there was this much action happening on the western frontier, beginning in 1827.
When Harry Truman was a young man serving as a soldier in the Missouri National Guard, he went to his grandmother's house dressed in his new blue uniform. And his grandmother, who remembered Order Number 11, told him next time he came not to wear that.
Yep. No, I forgot to.
We got a story.
Order Number 11 is one of those things. It pays dividends for decades to come, and one of them is that Harry Truman learns, who of course is a great lover of history from his childhood. One of the first books he gets is Generals and Battles of the Civil War.
It starts the Civil War Roundtable
of Kansas City. Yeah. Harry Truman realizes that you can't be vindictive after a war, or even during a war. And that is the fundamental thought behind one of his great contributions, the Marshall Plan. The reconstruction of Europe, including our enemies after World War II. Harry's folks were Unionists, but that didn't stop the Redlegs from not only helping themselves to their farm, their livestock and their crops. They tortured one of his great uncles, and the feelings were very raw. Not only when Harry came back in after World War I, but when he was in the White House, his mother refused to sleep in the Lincoln bedroom.
But they had mainly their lands had been taken through Order Number 11, and while they sought to be compensated for this, which they were told they might be if they were Unionists, they never were, and so she held that bitterly in her heart.
Well, just a comment. Last night I read in the Civil War History, Kent State University publication, letters from the President Truman to T. Harry Williams talking about how we should write more books about generals in the Western, the Western theater.
And T. Harry Williams, and there was no bigger Bruce Catton fan anywhere than Harry S. Truman. He loved Bruce Catton.
Are the legislatures in Missouri and or Kansas going to do anything about maintaining the rivalry in football every year?
Kansans like to say that Missouri, going to the SEC, is now right back where they belong in the slaveocracy. Missourians say that Kansas is going back to being a one-sport school. But a friend of ours, Jenny Weber, teaches history at the University of Kansas, and it is her assertion that the border war was actually a concoction of journalists from my old employer, the Kansas City Star, back in the 1980s and 1990s, and that then corporate marketers got their hands on it and it became the border war. However, then you talk to some old-timers and they say, yeah, we always hated Missourians. And, and Norm Stewart would deliberately fuel up the Missouri bus, in Kansas, on the Missouri side, and then they drive in, play their game, come back out, eat on the Missouri side, so they never spent $1 in the state of Kansas.
No, we had that feeling right from the start when we moved to where we live, which is 2 blocks from Kansas. We immediately felt there was something going on between these two states. I mean, I lived near the border of Iowa in Minnesota, and I can tell you there wasn't anything like that going on. When I became a reenactor and was writing Clarina Nichols' biography, I went to Liberty, Missouri to get some costume advice and so forth, and I got into a huge fight with the proprietor of the store who ended up not selling me anything because I was representing an abolitionist woman from the 1850s.
We were told that store has since come under new management. It does say something. Well, thank you very much. It's been a great 10 of crowd. We appreciate the question.